Now, John.
Yes, Ross.
Ever since I've known you, I've been impressed at your clarity of thinking, your ability to look beyond the short-term benefits and take into account the longer-term costs of many of these policies and things you see.
You clearly haven't spoken to my daughters.
I should speak to them quickly then. This leads me to ask, who or what got you started in this way of analytical thinking, and at what age were you first conscious of this?
Well, I can't answer you because it must have been incremental, but my father handed out the petition against bank nationalisation around the town of Dalwallinu. I can remember the party the night the Menzies government won. My father thought the wheat board was a bit of a joke, and when I came to growing wheat myself and so on, I mean, the wheat board taught me an awful lot about how not to manage an economy. I was busy delivering every weed seed I could to the pool. I didn't grow quality wheat, which I could have quite easily grown on my land type, because I wasn't paid for it. Fair average quality was it. And look, the wheat industry was very foolishly run. Of course, when you compare it with the later attempts to run the wool industry, it pales into insignificance, but that was from the future.
This is the imposition of minimum standards.
Minimum standards, regulation. I couldn't go and find the buyers that were interested in my type of wheat. I mean, I knew I could produce quality, but I wasn't allowed to go and sell it, so I didn't.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's how you got started. Now, history has shown that the adoption of these free market policies and the tactics as formulated by your parliamentary group called the Drive led to the reactivation of Australia's economy through the 80s and 90s, and I was fortunate in being part of the business community, and those policies benefited us all. It was like a glider pilot catching an updraft. It was a great economy that we suddenly found ourselves riding in. Now, first of all, who exactly are these drives that we hear so much about and are covered in your book called Dry in Defence of Freedom?
They defy definition. I've forgotten the exact figure, but the exact count of the best grouping we had on any policy was motor cars, and I think it was in the late 30s, but anyway, it might have been the early 40s. There were a lot of them, but there were 4 of us sort of did the organising. 3 of us worked together, and Jim Carlton, Peter Shack and myself, and Murray Sainsbury worked on Treasury Committee and mainly did his own thing, but we were aware of what he was doing and he was aware of what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so there were 3 organisers, and we worked together very closely. Used to meet in Carlton's office before each party meeting, mainly because Carlton had sun through his window and a very high quality class of tea he used to buy.
Well, that's a small number with a big result. It was a very effective number.
A politician's given many privileges. I mean, the parliamentary library was invaluable.
Yep.
He did a lot of work for us. I mean, only Bill Hayden had incurred greater costs for the parliamentary library than I did.
Okay.
Leader of the opposition.
Okay. It's resources, the use of resources. Now,
and anyone will talk to a politician, an academic, if you want advice on something.
Okay.
He's flattered to be asked.
Here's another quick question. How come your group was so singularly unsuccessful at having your own party, the Liberal Party, adopt any of these policies? However, you got who were then the opposition, you got the Labor Party to embrace these policies with enthusiasm.
The Labor Party adopted those policies, but the tide was running that way. The zeitgeist was in favour of change. We were only part of it, right? We did something that was useful, but there were a lot of others working on it too. think of Bill Carmichael at the Industries Assistance Commission. And anyway, I put a tougher argument than Bill. But Fraser was probably afraid. I doubt whether the thinking was very clear in Cabinet, but I personally tend to make a moral judgment that they knew what they had to do and elected not to do it for its political risk. Now, we had block supply and got in there. The only excuse, perfectly legitimately in my view, but the only excuse for doing that is that we were going to provide better government, not that we continued the old policies.
Okay.
So, we were failing in our social responsibility. I think probably all four of us thought that, and that our great and glorious leaders should be told so.
Okay, and then along came the Labor Party.
Yeah, there were a lot of it, right around the world, not just here. Yeah. And the world was moving in that direction at that time. I don't want to take anything away from Hawke. He was a great leader. But he also had a great leader of the opposition in Hyde, who made it easy for him. Mm. If we had an influence, or we would have had some influence on both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, the most important influence we probably had was on Hyde. Because I know he had some fights getting the National Party or Country Party to go along with him in not opposing Hawke when Hawke was doing the right thing.
Okay, now, right now Australia's GDP growth is pretty much stalled, and I've been to a couple of conferences overseas the last couple of weeks. I see 7 African countries have got a higher rate of GDP than we have, including PNG and most of the Asian countries. Is there a policy that you would pick, a single policy that you could say, if we wanted to reactivate our economy now, what would you do?
You accidentally said GDP when you meant GDP growth in that.
GDP,
but apart from that,
GDP growth.
Look, the one reform that everybody, or most people would agree, the unions wouldn't, is labour market reform. That could do more good for the Australian economy than any other single policy, or do it quicker anyway.
Thanks, John. Now, just one final comment before I hand over to Tim Lefroy. Your writings in your book, The Dries, and has been well received and is getting a lot of circulation. We've used a lot of that material in our Libertarian Handbook. We call it a primer for future leaders of Western Australia. The ideas are being picked up by the next generation of leaders. One such person is Tim Lefroy. And he was a Mannkal scholar that Mannkal sent off to the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. And Tim has some questions for you, so I'll now hand over to Tim to conclude and continue the questioning. Tim, welcome to the camera.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay.
How are you, John?
In preference to go to the Institute of Economic Affairs, I once told Arthur Selden that 2 Lord North Street was holy ground.
Fantastic place, yeah. It's a really interesting time. But we'll keep cracking on, John. Obviously, Paul Kelly is very influential, particularly as a political commentator.
He's probably our top political commentator still. He's been there for a long time.
Yeah, very, very highly regarded. But his thesis came out recently and said basically that the climate for reform in Australia is broken. Would you agree with that?
Well, there's still possible to reform, but it's not as easy as it has been, 10, 20 years ago. And if Kelly is right in that, and I think he is, that is very serious indeed.
And how do you go about changing that, though?
Well, there are a lot of little things I can think of, nothing big. But first of all, a group like the three of us that used to meet in Jimmy Carlton's office has to sit down and work out what can be done, what's practical, what are the important fruit to pick, and what are the low-hanging fruit that you can grab and should grab them just because you can get them. That's the first and I think essential step. The think tanks might work together to direct their policy at improving the ability to put your case. The Australian years ago ran a seminar on reform. It could do the same again using Paul Kelly's book as the central. The conversation would automatically go to that last chapter.
So let's just jump back for a second to think tanks. Obviously, the IEA, as you mentioned before, had a particularly influential period throughout the Thatcher government, and again, you were involved in the IPA after your political career. Has the role of think tanks and particularly libertarian institutions changed in policy discussions?
Oh, well, let's just look at Australian ones for the moment, otherwise it's going to get too complicated. They had more influence back 25 years ago than they've got today. The reason they had less influence in the interim is that people perceive things to be going well. Now, I think their influence, or in the last 2 years, when looking particularly at the two big ones, the CIS and the IPA, has grown again, because 3 years of very poor government has got people a bit frightened again. So they're looking around for ideas and what can be done about it. Now sure, we'll only have a small readership, we only ever do. But the stakes are huge, and if you can add 0.5% to that readership, with all the trickle down that could have, could make a very big difference.
But it's a bit paradoxical though, isn't it? In times of downturn and crises, people look for new ideas, but do you think people lose confidence in the systems of economic policy and the ideas that got us to this point?
I think it was ever thus throughout history. If you let the crisis get too steep, people can't recover. The thing is to bring on change, necessary change, before the crisis deepens. Before you've got the Japanese army in Port Moresby or whatever.
And John, you were talking before about people's ability to put their case, and particularly one of the most interesting and different things about the Dryers was the way they were involved in policy discussions. And people often say about the Dryers that they were different because people never hated or disliked them typically as a group. Why was that, do you think?
The thing that I'm most proud of is that we managed to be a pain in the neck to the government, and we certainly were, and we made it somewhat less likely that some of the marginal seat holders would retain their seats. But in spite of that, we retained their friendship.
Why was that?
I think that we were unusually careful to behave honourably. Well, I mean, I'm not to say we were never trapped, but we never broke confidences consciously, and we were very careful not to. We were very careful to follow the rules of the party, and what we could do and couldn't do. I mean, we didn't just romp across the floor to the other side of the house without telling the whips what we were going to do. I mean, we behaved ourselves inside the rules of the game. We were never attacked character, even across the house. We tried to be relatively light-hearted. I'm not certain we were all good at that, but we tried. We never impugned other people's motives unnecessarily, and people stayed friendly to us. They mightn't have agreed with us, but they were prepared to accept that we thought we were talking truths.
And was this just a cultural thing, I guess, from the four maybe that formed the Dryers, or was it a conscious decision you made, or was it?
Oh, it was a decision we made.
Or was it just?
I mean, I'd like to think it was cultural, and we were all well brought up. We probably were, but that's not the point. We was conscious, and we discussed it. We were very, very careful. I think we were the best organised group going back to the 1920s. As you go further back, my history's a bit shaky, but...
In what way, though, were you really well organised?
Well, we discussed our tactics. We were frank with each other. We were careful not to put personal advantage ahead of what we had identified in words as the national interest. I mean, it wasn't just a perception of the national interest. There was that there too, but an awful lot of it had been spelled out to each other. You know, we eyeballed each other, and you know, we'd exchange banter and friendly insults and so on, but we were pretty clear to each other.
Do you think some of those qualities are lost these days in modern day politics?
I
particularly in
doubt it.
Australia?
What has happened is the practices have changed. I think I'm doing a bit of guessing now. That attention to opinion polls, the whole business of wedge politics, the little discussion of the national interests, although the think tanks try, and the academics are a mixed group, as they always have been, I think. Some do, some don't. But politics has become more bitter. I mean,
What's that?
Mick Young called out to me across the house, any more of that from the member for more, I'll come across and pull his other bloody arm off. Now, I broke up laughing, as Mick knew very well I would. I think if that remark were made, or it wasn't exactly a remark, it gave the speaker some trouble, and if that were said today, all sorts of people would try to pretend that something reprehensible had been said, whereas it was just a joke. I don't think that would happen today.
Perhaps that sense of humour is lost.
Yeah, well, we've become precious. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yes,
It's too ready to take umbrage.
it's a difficult balance, though, and you're saying as well that I guess the dryers, they put a lot of faith and put a lot of value in keeping confidence, but the backbenchers' role has changed quite a bit in the past 20 years, though, and it's quite different to the dryers these days.
Backbenchers have always accused leaders of being high-handed, of ignoring them, not recognising their genius, and I don't think that will ever change. The fact is that leaders have to make some calls. It's when what was different about us is that we perceived that the calls that could have been made in the national interest were not being made, and we had the effrontery to point it out, as others have, but we were damn sight better organised at doing it.
So it really was your organisation as a group, though.
Yeah,
That
we trusted each other, and people trusted us, and that had a lot to do with it. That book, The Dry, that Ron was waving around earlier on, was written solely to convince young people like yourself, and I hope will be a politician one day.
that's very worrying.
Yes, you should worry. That it can be done, and that it can be done both effectively and honourably. And that's all that book was intended to get across.
Yes, fascinating read. I think people...
I wouldn't have said that.
I think politics has become very alienated, though, from particularly young people these days. And
That's right. If you have the privilege of living in a democracy, you inherit the responsibility of preserving it. And it will only survive if next time this nation goes to war, it doesn't have to send Wirraways up against zeros. That we maintain our economy, that we maintain our liberties, freedom of speech. I mean, the IPA's done great work on that. Freedom of association, the right to criticise. I mean, political correctness is doing us quite a lot of damage. But this preciousness, where people can't speak their mind, and it's hard for dissidents are not accepted.
is there a balance, though, between social progression, though, with regards to freedom of speech, and people become more aware of infringing on other people's rights? Where's the balance, do you think?
I'll admit it's debated, and some people whom I respect disagree with me. But my position is, all I demand is the right to tell a racist idiot that he's wrong.
John, on that note, we might leave it there, but thank you very much for coming in today. It's a fascinating read, Dry.
I'm just going to repeat the one important point. Someone has to, like the Dryers, has to organise to decide what can be done. Because people like me are too old and too out of touch. You've got to do it.
Right. Thank you very much, John. Cheers.